Well, thanks again for being here. I think the question that I want to start with, given my experience with students of this generation, can you just tell us what evangelicalism is, or maybe what evangelicalism was in the world before Trump? Like what the definition might be, how it felt to be evangelical, why people would want to do this?
The world before Trump.
Yeah. What do you think?
Do any of you remember the world before Trump? It's
Yeah.
remarkable to me when I spend time on college campuses, and let me just pause and say thank you so much, everybody, for having me here. I've been looking forward to this. I'm just really humbled by the opportunity to spend this evening with you guys, and hope to learn a little bit from you. We are in this crazy vortex of an election season and barreling down the home stretch here, and all of us are just trying to keep our sanity for 6 more days, although I have a sneaking suspicion it's not going to be resolved in 6 days. More on that later, maybe. Anyway, I'm really honored to be here and just appreciate Kate and all the efforts to get me here. It's interesting. When I was a kid, and I grew up in a Protestant denomination called the EPC, the Evangelical Presbyterian Church. And what I and my older brothers were always taught was that to be an evangelical meant to be really concerned with evangelizing as an active verb. Now, that might cause you to say, okay, well, still, what does that mean? What are we talking about here? I think if you go back to the Greek, the word that was used in the New Testament that informs us today was euangelion. And the very simple derivative there is just referring to gospel, or even more accurately, good news. What is the good news? Now, for some of you who may have grown up attending church, or some of you who may attend church now, I know that we are in the least religious region of the country here, so I assume that is maybe not a majority of you. You may already have an idea of what I'm talking about. For those of you who don't, the good news is not what is printed on the front page of the newspaper or what you might catch on your TikTok feed or wherever you're consuming your news these days. The good news in this context is referring to the gospel of Jesus Christ, the idea that God, in his attempt to reconnect with a broken humanity that had strayed from him and that had that continued to bear his image, yet was no longer sort of in alignment with his perfect and holy and just standard, needed some sort of a mediator, needed some sort of an atonement, a way to make things right again and to make, I don't want to get too deeply theological and get over my skis, but to essentially create a new creation, as Paul writes about in the New Testament. The idea being that in the original creation in the Garden of Eden, when everything was perfect and when God and man and animal and the world were living in perfect harmony, that was an ideal, that was the creation ideal, and that had been lost with the entrance of sin and violence and wickedness and evil in the world. And so the good news is that God, in this attempt to reconnect with and enter back into harmony with a humanity that he made in his own image, that he sent his son, that he took on flesh, that there was this man who lived 2,000 years ago, born in Palestine, who was both fully man and fully God. And that when he was 33 years old, he was able to take upon himself the sin and the depravity and the brokenness of all mankind, and was not only atoning for those sins by dying on the cross as the sort of perfect sacrificial lamb that many religions would have looked to in the ancient world as a way of atoning for sin. But that then by rising from the dead 3 days later, that Christ was then able to justify us in front of God. That is the sort of basic idea around what the good news is. And for an evangelical Christian, the way that they would distinguish themselves from a Roman Catholic, certainly, and we saw Martin Luther invoke this language of evangelion in his break from the Roman Catholic Church 500 years ago. The idea being that not only in distinguishing from the Roman Catholic tradition, but then also from the more sort of mainstream or mainline Protestant tradition here in the United States, the idea was that evangelicals really meant business. Evangelicals really took their Bible seriously, that the Bible wasn't just a book about God, but that the Bible was and is a book written by God, that it is God's living, breathing word delivered to us. And so to be an evangelical at one time in this country meant something very specific, that people understood whether you were inside of the church, whether you were in another church or another sort of religious subculture, whether you were outside of the church and just sort of looking on as an interested observer. There was a sort of a widely agreed upon definition of what it meant to be an evangelical Christian. And then what it started to happen, without giving you hours of chapter and verse history on this, although I certainly could because it's a fascinating thing to learn about. But effectively what began to happen in the 1970s is that a lot of the old kind of fragmented Christian tribes, if you will, began sort of slowly and then more and more quickly to coalesce and come together under this sort of shared banner of evangelicalism. And the thing that was bringing them under this shared banner wasn't theology, it wasn't church doctrine. In fact, there were still some very significant disagreements and fractures around those things. What really started to bring all of these different Christians together was ideology, was partisanship, was a view that this blessed American nation, a nation conceived, at the very least, conceived out of a belief in a higher power, and for many of these folks, a belief that this nation was in fact conceived in covenant with God himself, that this was a new Israel, that this was a chosen people to live in a chosen nation to then take the gospel of Jesus Christ to all the other nations, and to have this shining city on a hill be sort of the exemplar of Christianity for the world. In this period of the 1970s, for a lot of these folks, they begin to look around and see that the culture is changing, that the country no longer resembles the one that they thought they knew, that this was no longer, in its character, a Christian nation. And you can point to the Supreme Court taking prayer out of public schools. You can point to the Roe v. Wade decision legalizing abortion. You can point to the pornography culture, which is beginning to explode. You can look at the drug culture, which is beginning to explode. Divorce rates skyrocketing. You also have a serious cultural, sociological shift around race relations in this time. And you are dealing in many of these communities, predominantly southern and Midwestern communities, you're dealing with issues around redlining, around busing, and around the question of how we accommodate black communities and minority communities, non-white communities. And this is something that for some very ultra-conservative religious institutions, they are grappling with even the basic ideas of integration and of allowing interracial dating or interracial marriage in their churches or on their campuses. And so all of this is coming together in a very condensed window of time. And suddenly, all of these people in these various sects of American Christianity have all decided to set aside many of their pre-existing disagreements and differences and band together in order to take back the country as they saw it. And the path to taking back the country was pretty explicit. It was, in 1980, we must defeat the great evil of Jimmy Carter. Now, some of the older folks back there are laughing. Not all of you are in on the punchline here. Jimmy Carter was a Sunday school teacher who was an elder in the Southern Baptist Convention. And I think just even more to the point, was sort of universally recognized as an archetype of decency, of humility, of a Christian ethic in the way that he treated people. And yet, because he was a Democrat and because he supported certain progressive policies, he became sort of a poster child of this liberal drift, this secular progressive agenda that was going to come for you, and they were going to indoctrinate your children, and they were going to purge this country of its Christian DNA. And if we don't stand up and fight against it now, then we will lose this nation. Now, if some of that rhetoric sounds familiar, of course, it's because not much has changed. Here we are, almost 50 years later, hearing a lot of that same thing being said today. But what's so interesting is that during that period, the late 1970s and then into the 80s and beyond, evangelical morphs from having had this very sort of narrow, targeted religious identification to becoming more and more of a sort of cultural and political identification, to the point where now today you will see polling consistently where respondents will self-identify as evangelical, but in that same survey say that they haven't been to church in years or that they haven't read their Bible in years, right? So in other words, there is this sort of glaring disconnect between the identification phenomenon of American evangelicalism, and to be more pointed about it, white evangelicalism. There is a sort of a canyon between what that means in the culture versus what evangelicalism means to those in the church who are sort of adherents to what was classically understood to be the meaning of the term. That's a very long answer to your question.
Can I just use that for my Christianity class next time I run
Sure.
it? That was perfect.
Well, thank you for laying the groundwork there for all of us. Obviously, it's a very large term that has a lot of layers to it. But why Donald Trump? I mean, I think when you initially ran for president, there were certainly many other options, both Republican, Democrat, that could say, the candidates were more religious. They had some deeper expression of belief than Trump. But why did the evangelicals connect with him then and carry it through all the way to today?
It's a great question. I would really emphasize, and again, I recognize that a lot of you were in middle school or something when this was happening, right? So it's ancient history. But if you go back to 2016, what we should remember is that Donald Trump was actually loathed, really despised by much of the evangelical movement. I covered the 2016 Republican primary up close, personal, traveled with all the campaigns, knew everything that was sort of happening behind the scenes, wrote a lot about it, wrote about this quite a bit in my first book that came out in 2019 while Trump was president. And I just can't overstate the degree to which all of these sort of influential, well-connected, very visible evangelical leaders, they thought Trump was a charlatan, a fraud. They thought he was a despicable human being. They wanted nothing to do with him. And they were willing to rally around just about anybody else to stop him. First it was Jeb Bush. It was John Kasich. It was Marco Rubio. Ultimately, it was Ted Cruz. And they were willing to, a lot of them, actually sort of laid down gauntlets that would later come back to haunt them with just how vehement they were in their opposition to Donald Trump. And then something interesting happens. When Donald Trump clinches the Republican presidential nomination, A few weeks later, he has a couple of people in his orbit who helped to arrange this big meeting in New York City at the Marriott Marquis Hotel in Manhattan. And this is a summit, a faith summit, where Trump is going to go to a ballroom and stand up in front of 500 or 600 very prominent, powerful evangelical leaders and tell them why they should not be afraid of him and why they should support him for president. And I was there that day at the Marriott Marquis, staked it out 24 hours in advance, talked to everybody I could, got recordings from inside of the room, was really eager to see how people responded. And it was really interesting to see how on the way in there was this palpable hostility and cynicism. And on the way out, a lot of folks were sort of looking almost in a daze and talking very differently. You started hearing people saying, well, I don't really trust this guy. You know, he's got kind of a colorful personal history, but you know, if you read the Bible, God does use a lot of flawed characters, right? Oh boy. Now, once you open that door, folks, you have sort of, in some sense, created a permission structure to begin justifying and supporting and enabling that which you would otherwise never justify or support or enable. And you start hearing comparisons to King David, to Moses, or to King Cyrus, perhaps. The point being that a lot of these folks began to accommodate themselves to this reality of, he may not be one of us, but he will fight for us. And this started to become a very popular, whether consciously or subconsciously, a very popular sentiment in the evangelical world. Many of you probably don't know who King Cyrus is. He was, after the Jews were conquered and then exiled from Jerusalem under the reign of the Persian Empire, Cyrus the Great is, and this is historical, it's in the Bible, but it is also historical. Cyrus the Great is the Persian leader who allows the Jews to return to Jerusalem and to rebuild their temple, which had been destroyed. And the temple meant everything to the Jews, of course. And so he becomes viewed as this sort of heroic figure who, even though he is not one of them, he is like a protector of them. And Trump starts to take on sort of that same mythology for a lot of these people. And in fact, they take it one step further. They start to think to themselves, you know what? Actually, you know, we've had Christian leaders, good Christian men who have been our congressmen, our senators, in some cases even our, George W. Bush, self-identified evangelical. But being a good moral Christian was actually sort of holding them back at times, wasn't it? Because this country's going to hell. A good Christian can't really fight the way that we need to fight. If they're going to save Christian America as we know it, then maybe we need somebody who's willing to sort of get into the arena and roll up their sleeves and start throwing haymakers. And so Trump's lack of morality, Trump's lack of spirituality, Trump's lack of Christianity goes from being a great vulnerability to somehow being maybe his greatest asset in the minds of some of these folks. And if at any point in the last few years, if you've read some headline or seen something that he said or did and thought to yourself, how can Christians continue supporting this guy? Plug that thought into this formula that I've just presented for you and recognize that in some sense, whatever he says or does that is offensive or grotesque or antagonistic, actually in some way, strangely enough, endears him more and more to some of these folks. And I would just add to this, there's a very real persecution complex in the American Christian tradition. And I just want to linger on this for a moment because it's really important to recognize two things, okay? Number one, persecution, real persecution, is central to the story of the church dating back to the first century, right? The idea that not only was Jesus of Nazareth this poor, vagrant preacher who was born in the ghettos of, well, he was technically born in Bethlehem, but born to the ghettos of Galilee, and who was, nursed among the livestock and whose dad was a carpenter. The fact that this guy with no formal religious training, whose parents were nobodies, that he would come out of nowhere and challenge the Roman Empire, challenge the Jewish religious rulers of his day, and then that they would execute him and hang him naked on a tree for everybody to see, the sort of capital punishment that was reserved for only the truly contemptible and vile people in this age, right? This was the sort of revolution that nobody could have predicted, nobody could have anticipated. In fact, these Jews who had been waiting hundreds and hundreds of years for their promised Messiah, they were all expecting this military strongman who was going to ride in with a sword and slaughter all the Romans and reclaim their home, their ancestral homeland and make Israel great again. That was the plan. Right? Yeah, I said it, I know. That was the plan, right? It's very important to recognize this, that sort of nationalist impulse was alive and well 2,000 years ago at the time of Christ. And so when this guy comes along and says, no, you've heard it said that you love your neighbor and hate your enemies, but I tell you to love your enemy and pray for those who persecute you. I tell you, if someone strikes you on the one cheek, to turn the other cheek to them. This idea of nonviolent, self-sacrificial political revolution, if you will, but then even beyond that, this idea that once this poor Jew who had been executed by the state of Rome and hung on a tree naked for the world to mock and scorn, the idea that people for the next several hundred years all around the world would become his followers, and that this would become this explosive movement, and that they'd be willing to die for it, that they'd be willing to be fed to the lions, that they'd be willing to be hung on crosses themselves, that they'd be willing to be burned at the stake and used as human torches in the emperor's garden. This makes no sense to anybody, right? Some of you are listening to this and you're like, huh? Right? It only makes sense if, in fact, you, as they were, would become convinced that not only was this Jesus of Nazareth a historical figure, but in fact, he is exactly who he said he was. And if, in fact, that is true, then everything in my life must change to then revolve around this belief. And part of that was oppression, marginalization, torture, violence, and ultimately martyrdom. So persecution is a very real and very central element to the Christian tradition. And today, around the world, persecution is a very real thing. In China, in India, in sub-Saharan Africa, this is a very real thing where people suffer and die for their Christian faith. That does not happen here. And my fear, as I argue in the book, is that American Christians, because they are fewer in numbers than they used to be, because the culture has shifted in some real and dramatic ways against them, because the government and public policy and the sort of social fabric at large no longer reflects their core Christian values, they believe that that is persecution, and that then sort of justifies their lashing out and their, frankly, in many cases, sort of disposing of core Christian teachings, because much like when George W. Bush said that he had to abandon his free market principles to save the free markets. Now you guys were really young when this was happening. Like, you were, in Pampers. But when George W. Bush decided to bail out the banks because he was worried that there'd be a run and nobody would be able to take out money from the ATM anymore, and he said, look, if I'm going to save the free market, I've got to abandon free market principles, which meant, creating this trillion-dollar program. In the same way, many Christians now are saying to themselves, look, in order to save Christian virtue in America, we've got to abandon Christian virtue first to be able to fight that fight.
Okay, that's a lot to chew on. So maybe what we'll do is we'll open it up to questions, because there's a lot of fodder there.
Thank you. My name is Wilson. I'm from Oklahoma. My grandparents actually run the largest evangelical megachurch in New Orleans. And, Yeah,
Cool.
and I've had lengthy conversations with Congressman, former runner Jim Ryan, who I'm sure you know is a staunch evangelical, and they fit much of your litmus test. They're far way too into Trump for my comfort, and they're a bit overzealous. But what they don't want is a theocracy, which is, I think, the main litmus test of Christian nationalism. They would rather return to the party of Jefferson that dispelled from the sort of John Winthrop Christian sensibilities, and rather just depend on Christian values, not on theocracy. So don't you think that using terms like Christian nationalism to people who are not like Patrick Deneen, who advocate for the Pope to run the country, is valid grounds for persecution claims? Thank you.
It's a great question. And I know that I was super long in my responses to both of you guys, and we want to get to as many questions as we can, so I'll try to be concise. It's a very good question. Thank you for asking it. So I don't know that if you asked 10 Christians for their definition of Christian nationalism, if you would get one coherent answer. I think you might get 10 different answers. There's a great deal of disagreement around what it actually means, and there's even more disagreement around how prevalent it is. To your point, I think what I've discovered in my own journeys, in my own reporting, is that you have lots of people who I believe have become disproportionately political, disproportionate to their faith, that their entire identity has become consumed with partisan politics, and that they have almost sort of created a parallel secular religion that is in competition with their actual, theological beliefs. For me, in terms of what Christian nationalism actually is, and since you're from Oklahoma, I think you'll appreciate this more than most. I think the way I define it very simply is that Christian nationalism is best understood as the marriage of bad history and bad theology, okay? And one is very much a prerequisite for the other. What I mean by that is that when you see all of these efforts, very well coordinated and well funded efforts all around the country, to go to the school boards, to go to the state legislatures, to go to these vast networks of people who are in a position to literally rewrite history, to rewrite the textbooks, to teach you that, in fact, this was born to be an explicitly Christian nation. That the founders, when they wrote the First Amendment to the Constitution, when they wrote the Establishment Clause, that this was sort of an elaborate wink and nod, that really they did envision this as a country ruled by European Christian men overseeing governing institutions that had explicitly Christian aims, right? Now, none of that is true. But it is very attractive and, dare I even say, seductive to a great number of people who sort of survey the modern landscape of this country and believe that we've lost all of our sort of Christian heritage, right? That it's been taken from us by these evil, woke, secular Marxists, you fill in the blank. And they hear this sort of alternative history and think, yeah, I dig it. I like that. That makes more sense, right? And there can be some very cleverly cherry-picked quotes and documents to sort of hold up and say, see, this is what they wanted, right? And once you have that bad history, it's really amazing to see, and I've written about this a lot, but it's really amazing to see what people begin to do and how they begin to read Scripture differently. They start to interpret, and they start to, frankly, distort, willfully or otherwise, the teachings of Christ himself to say, well, actually, I am supposed to be fighting for this country. That is fighting for God. I'm fighting for God by fighting for America. This is the new Israel. Didn't you know? Now, what I'm describing here is a problem. It is not a problem at the scale that some people would have you believe, and I think this gets to the heart of your question. I was on a panel a couple of months ago with two of the smartest social scientists in the country who have spent years studying this. And they both estimated that in their best guess of it, that maybe we're talking about 3, 4, even 5% perhaps of the sort of Christian population that are true adherents, like diehard adherents to this idea, the ideals of Christian nationalism. Now, there are two ways of looking at that. One is that, well, that's a pretty small percentage. Another is that, well, even that small percentage, you're still talking about many, many millions of people. My concern is not with that relatively small percentage. Rather, my concern is with not the Christian nationalist people, but with the people who are Christian nationalist curious. They're sort of on the fence. They're sort of in a position where, yeah, I don't think I want a theocracy here. I'm pretty sure that I don't want, if Donald Trump wins, a declaration of Christianity as America's state religion, which has been bantered about, by the way, among people who would definitely work in his administration. There are lots of Christians who are conservative, Republican, Trump voters, check all the boxes, but then when you get to this question of theocratic takeovers of our institutions, they're like, I'm not sure I want to go there, right? But they're also, many of them, not outright rejecting it. They're not outright saying no because Christian nationalism is a contradiction in terms, and this is fundamentally not a Christian nation. Because being a Christian is to be a mini Christ. It is to have Christ dwell within you. It is an individual experience, right? You must be born again, Jesus says. What does that mean? Do I climb back into my mother's womb? No, that's not what it means. It means to be born again into the family of God, to become a co-heir to the kingdom of God. This is language that for some of you must sound incredibly peculiar, and I don't blame you at all. I see the one guy making a face back there like, did he just say that? Yeah, right? But once you start to recognize the true and profound implications of a conversion experience and what it means to be a mini Christ, then this idea of a nation, a country, a piece of land and a set of traditions and customs and languages and communities, the idea of that being a Christian entity just doesn't make sense. And so some people in this world that you're describing, I think, are very firmly already there, and they recognize the contradiction in terms. And then there are some people over here who are all in, and they are cool with theocracy. They want theocracy. They are down for theocracy. I think the concern and the great bulk of my attention is paid to the people in the middle. And much of what I'm writing about in my book is a sort of tug of war playing out with enormous stakes in the years ahead, because what you are seeing now in a lot of these evangelical spaces is a very sophisticated, very well-funded campaign aimed at doing the first piece of it, rewriting the history. And then, as I said, once you get that ball rolling, suddenly, before you even know it, you have people beginning to read their Bibles very differently. You have people who are no longer looking at politics through the context of their faith, but now they're looking at their faith through the context of politics.
Hi, I'm Aubrey. I'm from Rhode Island. I was wondering if you thought whether, at this point in time, we've seen politics kind of replace religion as a sense of community and identity, and what you think it would take for us to start to see a swing back where people are going back to church, where that's starting to become people's central piece of identity like it used to be.
That is another terrific question. Thank you for asking it, Aubrey. Yeah, look, a couple of things. There was a really interesting poll that was, I believe it was in the Wall Street Journal. This is like maybe 3 or 4 weeks ago. And it was measuring the degree to which politics is central to your life, asking Americans this question over a period of some decades, right? And it's one of those moments where you guys have this, I'm sure, you're reading something, you're watching something, and there's this thing that's been sort of in the back of your brain, like gnawing at you, that you kind of knew was there, and then suddenly you see something and it just like clicks, and you're like, yes, that's the problem, or that's the thing I was thinking about. And for me, I use the word identity a lot when I talk about religion and when I talk about politics, right? Because for a Christian, again, your identity is meant to be found entirely in Christ. Everything you do, the ways in which you engage with the world around you, there's a sort of infinite application for what it means to have Christ live in you and for you to live out the example of Christ in your life, right? That is your identity, fundamentally. The problem with the sort of political moment that we are in, as this Wall Street Journal poll was getting at, is that I think it showed like a 40-point climb over the last couple of decades to this question of how central are politics to your life. In other words, and there's some other good social science on this very question, but it's this idea that if you spend time with a political campaign, for instance, which I have done far too much of, and I can't wait to go start writing about insects or something at some point here. But I have been embedded with political campaigns, and I've had the chance to look at some of their algorithms and some of their internal modeling that they do. It's very sophisticated. These are people who raise tens of millions of dollars, and they build out these voter profiles of people like you and me. And what they'll do is they will look at anywhere from like 10 to 30 indicators. They will look at where you went to college, what make and model of a vehicle you drive, what kind of sitcoms you watch, what kind of apps you have on your iPhone, where you buy your groceries, what kind of beer you drink or wine you drink or whatever it is, right? They crunch all these things, and on the other end of it, it spits out a formula, and that formula is like 99.8% accurate in knowing how you vote, right? They just know. And these questions, these indicators have nothing to do with ideology, they have nothing to do with partisanship, they just know. Right? Because political identification has become the sort of ultimate tribal self-selection mechanism, if that makes sense, right? In other words, you are one of those people. This is why COVID was such I think, in many ways, it was a very illuminating time, but also a very deeply damaging time in the church of all places, because part of what I'm writing about in my book is how you have people who have been going to church together for 20 or 25 years, who have been in a Bible study together every week, who have watched their kids grow up together, who have prayed with each other when someone's wife got a cancer diagnosis or someone's kid died in a car accident. They are so close, right? And then during COVID suddenly, you had people coming to some of these churches, and they'd look over at somebody, and suddenly they have a mask on. Oh, you're one of those people. Or they're talking to somebody from their Bible study who doesn't want to get the vaccine, and they're not letting their kids get the vaccine. You say, oh, you're one of those people. The point being that somewhere along the way, not just in the church context, but the church context is maybe the most sort of vibrant and troubling example of this, somewhere along the way, those sort of political indicators, those political tribal markings of as I said, sort of self-selecting into these tribes, these communities that have in many other ways become diminished in American life. If you look at the findings and the research around loneliness and isolation, feelings of abandonment, right? This is, to me, at the core, and again, I wrote a lot about this in my first book, but if you've never had the chance, young people in the room, to read Bowling Alone, like go tomorrow, like go tonight, buy it on Amazon, read Bowling Alone by Robert Putnam, right? This idea that so many of our spaces in civil society where we found our identity, where we found our community in things that had nothing to do with Donald Trump, or nothing to do with Kamala Harris for that matter, with any of these jokers, right? The idea that we found our identity in lots of other things that had a much deeper meaning to us than just who do we pull the lever for on the first Tuesday in November. That has now sort of morphed into this very sort of lazy, lowest common denominator, red versus blue thing. And sadly, the one institution in American life that should transcend it, the church, has actually become hostage to it, I think, more than any other. And it's very sad.
Hi, I'm Rhea. I'm a freshman here at Colby, and in the last few years, you've seen a growing evangelical presence in both the GOP and Trump's administration. Even though on the campaign trail, former President Trump's rhetoric has been to let the states choose on issues like abortion, do you think this growing evangelical presence in his administration will lead to more pro-life policies when he actually is reelected, or if he's reelected?
I don't, actually, for a couple of reasons, and thank you for the question. It's obviously of great importance to people on both sides of this equation. Interestingly enough, even though abortion has been, and I believe next Tuesday will be, a sort of the galvanizing issue on the left, and obviously much of the Harris campaign's messaging, advertising, voter targeting has revolved around women and the question of abortion. I think what's maybe appreciated is the degree to which there is real angst on the right around how effectively Donald Trump and J.D. Vance have taken the win, as it were, on Roe v. Wade, and now said, look, we did what you asked, and we're going to move on now, right? There are other things that we're concerned with. Now, part of this is sort of for once, I will actually give Trump credit, because when he's been answering this question, he's said effectively, like, you're not going to have some law that comes to my desk anyway. And he's right. I mean, you're not going to have a national abortion ban come to his desk. If Republicans hold on to the House, it's going to be by fewer than 10 seats. If Republicans win the Senate, it's going to be by 2 or 3 seats. There is no, I mean, I covered Congress for many years. There's no meaningful or even feasible path for a national abortion legislation to get to the president's desk. That's for one thing. But also, I think more fundamentally, Trump and his campaign recognized that, look, this is an election that's going to be won or lost in the suburbs of Detroit and Milwaukee and Philadelphia and Phoenix and Vegas and Charlotte and Raleigh-Durham and Atlanta, right? And the one thing we know about those suburbs are that they are overwhelmingly populated by college-educated women who are deeply animated by the issue of abortion. And so Trump, who knows that he's not going to win these voters, that demographic I'm describing, but he knows that he has to keep his margins, right? He can't, in other words, like one of the classic examples of this, I'll give you a cheat sheet here. So in 2020, on election night, I was texting with a buddy of mine at Politico, and he said, hey, what's going to happen in Oakland County? What's the over-under? A lot of reporters talk in college football betting terms because it keeps us sane during this season. So Oakland County, Michigan is right outside of Detroit. It's the area where I live. And Oakland County is your sort of quintessential sort of white-collar, college-educated, two-car garage suburban area where a lot of affluent people live who for generations had voted very reliably Republican and now over the last 10 to 15 years vote overwhelmingly Democratic, right? And it's all sort of along cultural lines. And meanwhile, in the other sort of exurban counties moving farther away from Detroit are all of these blue-collar voters who for generations voted Democratic and now, on cultural lines, have moved consistently into the Republican ranks. So there's been this sort of inversion along lines of class and culture and education and whatnot. The reason I'm mentioning all of this is to say that when my friend texts me on election night 2020 and says, so what's the over-under in Oakland County? I said, I'd say 14 points, right? He said, wow, 14 points. If Biden wins Oakland County by 14 points, he's got to win Michigan, right? I said, yeah, if he wins Oakland County by 14 points, that means he's probably winning the election because he's carrying those suburban voters and more specifically those college-educated women in these areas, right? So fast forward to the results coming in, Biden wins it by 13.9. So I felt very good about this. I was puffing my chest out telling him that he should buy me a beer. The reason I'm stressing this, though, is that if you were to look next Tuesday, and we won't have the results on Tuesday night because Michigan counts slow, because Republicans won't let them count faster, it's a whole thing. Don't get me started. But when you look at the results in Oakland County, I will tell you right now, if Harris wins Oakland County by like 15 or 16, it might not be enough. Because Trump has made significant inroads with young men, particularly young men of color, and we are seeing some meaningful movement in his direction among demographics that have not supported him in the past. And that means Harris has to make up a big difference somewhere else, namely in these suburban areas with these women voters. So Harris probably needs to win a county like Oakland by like 17 and a half, 18 points, maybe even 18 and a half, 19 points. If she does that, then I think she wins. So watch Oakland County next week. To your question, though, Trump knows this, right? Trump's people know this. And I don't think it's an elaborate ruse when they're basically saying we're just taking a hands-off approach to the abortion issue anymore. They campaigned on it twice before. It was a problem. Now it's really a problem because the dog caught the car and Roe v. Wade fell. And a lot of Republicans have spent the last few years saying, gosh, be careful what you wish for, right? Because it has become a political albatross for the party. But I do not think that they're going to suddenly win and then Trump's going to get into office and say, okay, what do we do about abortion? I think on Trump's list of concerns, abortion is probably at the very bottom. He himself is not invested in it. He does not care. You could continue to see some Republican action in the states around this, and I think you will to some degree. But I got to be honest with you. What we've seen over the last 3.5 years is consistently, even in red states, much less in purple states, time after time, whenever this has come up on an initiative or a referendum, the pro-choice side has won, and often won decisively. And I think a lot of Republicans have gotten to the place where they're like, you know what, we're not going to pick this fight anymore. And if I can say one more thing, to loop this back into the conversation around evangelicalism, for a lot of evangelicals, abortion became sort of a gateway drug to become hooked on politics. Here's what I mean by that. I think that for a lot of evangelicals who were otherwise sort of indifferent, they were very loosely engaged with politics, but they didn't wear the red hat or the blue hat. They didn't really feel like they had a team. During the 1980s, when abortion politics really became central to the identity of the Republican Party, there was this idea for a lot of evangelical voters that, well, look, we are not called to rule the world. We are not called to, invade the political arena and try to dictate to everyone based on our faith. That's not our calling, but we do have lines in the sand, moral and ethical, spiritual lines in the sand, and the taking of unborn life should be one of them. They're saying to themselves, if not this, then what? And so you begin to see a lot of churches, a lot of evangelical institutions mobilizing around the pro-life cause. Fine. You look at that and you can say, even if you have completely the opposite views and you wholeheartedly disagree with them, you could look at that and say, well, okay, I understand from a sort of principled standpoint, ethically, morally, and otherwise, why someone would dedicate their time and their vote to that specific issue. Sure. But what starts to happen is that when you see one team fighting the fight on your side and the other team opposing it, slowly but surely, you start to see every policy dispute, even the ones that have nothing to do with abortion, falling along those same tribal kind of binary lines. So one day it's, well, we're fighting for life. And the next day it's, can you believe those evil Democrats want to raise our taxes? Right? And the slope was very slippery getting there. And even when you get into questions like funding anti-poverty programs or, fighting wars that are taking hundreds of thousands of lives in the Middle East, you might expect on paper to see the bulk of the evangelical movement rising up and making their voice heard on those things, and rising up and agitating in a way that is not politically consistent, right? It's not, the idea of Christianity belonging to one party or the other, the idea that Jesus is a mascot for the elephants or for the donkeys, is not only offensive, but it just makes no sense biblically or theologically. So the Christians I know who I respect the most are the people who are often very uncomfortable in their respective settings because they are staunchly anti-abortion, but they are also staunchly anti-gun, right? These are people who have at least some sort of intellectual and moral consistency with the arguments they set forth. But with abortion, I think it really became such a passionate and in many ways almost a blinding issue for so many people that they were unable to then kind of remove themselves from it to any degree and discern where a party that was aligned with them on this one issue was then beginning to manipulate them to keep them in the fold on a whole host of other issues that really were not at all reflective of their core beliefs.
So before we do more student questions, we've got like 10 minutes left, Tim, so I'm going to do more rapid fire. But I do want to, Professor Urich, I see you nodding over and over, and this is your area of teaching. And I'd love to know, what are you thinking about? What do you want to ask Tim?
I want to talk about conspiracism. Like QAnon, I feel like, has been under the radar in this conversation. This is when you went for COVID, we briefly touched on the vaccines, right? And I'm kind of wondering what you see as the relationship between evangelicalism, conspiracism, Trump, and COVID. It's a small
Rapid
question.
fire? You want rapid
Yeah.
fire on that?
In 30 seconds.
You asked the wrong guy for rapid fire.
Yeah.
This is my whole thing.
Man, look, so I'll say a couple of things. You know, I get asked this question all the time, some version of this question of, well, are Christians, by virtue of their belief in this extraordinary, miraculous thing, right, a virgin birth and a resurrection after death, are they sort of inherently predisposed to be gullible, to be tricked? And it's an interesting question. I think some Christians would be offended by it. I'm not offended as a Christian in thinking about it. I don't know that I would say gullible necessarily, but I will say this. I think Christians have become very easy marks for cons. And if I can be really blunt about it, when you look at Donald Trump's relationship with the evangelical world, what is it if not a con man spotting the ultimate mark, right? What I mean by that is if you are sort of inherently trustworthy, if you are inherently looking for the good in your neighbor, if you believe in the power of transformative renewal of self and the idea that that whether it's with Augustine of Hippo or whether it's with St. Paul or whether it's with C.S. Lewis or Charles Colson or anyone, that there can be a great redemptive experience around the corner for even the darkest and most depraved of us. If you cling to these beliefs, which, by the way, I do, right? If those beliefs are core to who you are, then I do sense that maybe you are somewhat more open to things that might seem to others to be a little bit kooky, to be a little bit out there, to be sort of untethered from reality, including certain conspiracy theories, including QAnon. Now, here's where I give the pivot. Jesus said, knock and the door will be opened to you, right? The truth will set you free. I'm often asked, because my dad was a pastor, if I ever considered it, and the answer is absolutely not. I would have been a horrible pastor, and I'm really glad that I never felt the Lord calling me in that direction. But I do feel very fortunate that I have a calling on my life. I believe that journalism is a calling. And the reason I feel that journalism is a calling is because it is a pursuit of truth. Now, that happens to dovetail really nicely with my personal obligation to pursue truth as a Christian. And so on the one hand, it has broken my heart to see the degree to which some elements of the evangelical community, both at the sort of micro level with people I know and love in where I grew up, friends, family, and then sort of expanding out to the kind of macro evangelical community in this country. Heartbreaking to see how many of these folks have fallen for these deceptions and have sort of, in many cases, even married some of the conspiratorial stuff around stolen elections and evil vaccines and QAnon and the like, married that with their Christian faith. It is sort of almost folded into their theology, which is especially heartbreaking. At the same time, I and lots of other Christians I know are working hard to bring these people back into the fold, to try our best in love, in humility, to reach out, to engage in good faith, to have conversations with people who, for any number of reasons, may have drifted a bit and may have lost their ability to discern what is truth from what is not truth. And by the way, that is not exclusive to the Christian community. I would encourage the people in this room, especially the young people, these college years of yours, especially on a campus like this, you can find yourself in a little bit of a bubble where you are hearing the same things, reading the same things, reinforcing a worldview again and again and again, and you begin to lose that sort of texture of what exists beyond. And the other, the capital O, other, becomes a sort of an afterthought, that with which you do not need to engage. I would encourage you, one of the things that I just can't stress enough from my own reporting experiences, and I've spent the last 8 years just traveling this country constantly, meeting with thousands and thousands of regular people in regular places, and there are so many people out there who, when you put just a hard freeze, a timeout on talking politics, are some of the best, most generous, loving, warm, welcoming people you'd ever want to meet. And then if they say something about politics, you'd be like, what? And you'd be like, wow, are they a crazy person? And I didn't realize it this whole time. If you can stop seeing people as a part of one team or another, whether this is in your secular pursuit of bettering your communities and building a better pluralistic society, or whether it is a part of your Christian pursuit of loving your neighbors and attempting to show Christ to all those who you come into contact with, whatever the case may be, try your very best. I know I've run far afield of the question about conspiracies, but it's important to recognize how many people are lonely and hurting and vulnerable to be drawn into something that they don't entirely understand. If I can add one more thing to this, because I feel like this has been a lot of doom and gloom. So let me say this, as I know we're moving towards closure here. I had a very MAGA friend tell me this joke, and so I therefore feel licensed to retell it to other audiences on the question of conspiracies. So there are these two MAGA guys at a Trump rally, wearing the hats, chanting the chants. They're all fired up. Best day of their lives. They're really, really excited to see their guy. And the rally ends, and they're walking out, and they're on cloud 9, and they can't even believe it, and they're not paying attention, and boom, hit by a bus, dead. So they go to heaven, and they're standing at the pearly gates, and St. Peter says, "Gentlemen, welcome to the afterlife. Really honored to have you here. Congratulations. Before I let you into heaven, is there anything that you'd like to know?" And the first guy says, "Yeah, actually, now that we're here, St. Pete, you got to level with me. Did Joe Biden really win the 2020 election?" St. Peter says, "My friend, I'm sorry to let you down, but the answer is yes. Yes, he did. He won fair and square." And the second guy says, "This goes even higher than we thought." Listen, if you can't, we're on a death march to November 5th here. If you can't take a minute to laugh, you're going to lose your mind. Look, there are people out there. I had a guy say to me, I had the most wonderful long meal with this guy a few years ago. I wrote about him in my book. And he was such a nice dude. We grew up in the same area. He's a little older than I am. Works with his hands for a living, has a great family, part of his community, give you the shirt off his back, gives tons of money to charity, like, great guy. And then we get to talking about the election, and he's just, and he says to me at one point, he says, "Tim, I am as sure that Donald Trump won the 2020 election as I am that Jesus rose from the dead 2,000 years ago." And like, honestly, it was it hurt bad, right? But what am I called to do? What are you called to do with people like that in your lives? Ostracize them? Mock them? Marginalize them? Push them to the periphery of society and, hope that, the actuarial tables come for people like them so that we can have a better country moving forward? I mean, that's a conversation that is had in a lot of these sort of lefty bubbles. And I think that we have to be very honest about our prejudices and our biases when we have these conversations around conspiracies, but also just the basic humanity that lies beneath, and understanding how a lot of otherwise very good people have gotten to a rather dark place.
Okay, I think this is probably our time. So can you join me in thanking Tim for joining us?